In a quiet suburb of Seattle, Washington, the life of the Hudson Kowalski family seemed ordinary and measured. No one could have predicted that behind the facade of well-being lay a tangled web of passions that would lead to tragedy. The story, which shocked not only the local community but the entire country, began with an innocent acquaintance and grew into a secret affair with a deadly outcome. 19-year-old Jason Hudson, a student at the local college, was dating Emily Kowalski, his peer. Their relationship seemed perfect until Margaret Kowalski, Emily's 63-year-old mother, entered Jason's life. What began as friendly communication soon developed into something more, forbidden and dangerous. This is a story about how uncontrolled emotions and hidden desires can lead to irreversible consequences. About how one thoughtless act can destroy the lives of many people. We will trace the development of events that led to the tragedy and try to understand what made ordinary people commit a terrible crime. Jason Hudson grew up in a middle-class family. His father worked as an engineer, and his mother was a school teacher. From childhood, Jason was distinguished by his curiosity and determination. In school, he was an excellent student, actively participated in social life and sports events. After entering college in the business administration department, Jason had ambitious plans for the future. Emily Kowalski was the only daughter of Margaret and the late Stephen Kowalski. She grew up in a well-off family where her father practiced law, and her mother devoted herself to raising her daughter in charity work. Emily inherited her mother's attractive appearance and sharp mind. In college, she studied psychology and dreamed of becoming a clinical psychologist. Margaret Kowalski, the widow of a well-known lawyer, was a bright and charismatic woman. Despite her age, she retained her attractiveness and vitality. After her husband's death, Margaret actively engaged in social activities, organized charity events, and was known in Seattle's high circles. However, behind the external glitter was a lonely woman who was struggling with the loss of her husband and aging. Jason and Emily met at a college party. Their relationship developed rapidly, and soon they became one of the most noticeable couples on campus. Jason's parents approved of their son's choice, seeing Emily as an educated and promising girl. Margaret was also glad that her daughter was dating a purposeful young man from a good family. The first meeting between Jason and Margaret took place at a family dinner that Emily organized to introduce her boyfriend to her mother. At first, nothing foretold future events. Margaret was welcoming and charming, Jason was confident and respectful. Emily was pleased to observe how the two closest people to her found common ground. However, something changed that very evening. Jason was struck by Margaret's vitality and intellect, her ability to converse on any topic. Margaret, in turn, saw in the young man not just her daughter's boyfriend, but an interesting interlocutor in communication with whom she felt younger. After this meeting, Jason began to visit the Kowalski house more often. He helped around the house, participated in family events, gradually becoming almost a family member. Emily was happy, not suspecting that something more than just friendly relations was developing between her beloved and her mother. Thus began a story that led to tragic consequences and changed the lives of all its participants forever. None of them could have predicted where this seemingly innocent meeting would lead and what price they would have to pay for their feelings and actions. The relationship between Jason and Margaret began to change imperceptibly. At first, it was accidental touches during joint work in the kitchen, long glances stolen when no one was looking. Margaret began to invite Jason more often to help her with various household chores, especially when Emily was busy studying. One evening, when Emily was delayed in the library preparing for exams, Jason came to the Kowalski house to fix a leaking faucet. Margaret, dressed in a lighthouse dress, offered him wine after work. They sat on the veranda, talking about life, dreams, and disappointments. Jason was amazed by the depth of Margaret's thoughts, her life experience, and wisdom. Margaret, in turn, felt long-forgotten excitement at the sight of the young, energetic Jason. At some point, their eyes met, and they both realized that something more than just friendship had arisen between them. The first kiss was unexpected for both, but it opened the floodgates of restrained emotions. They understood that their feelings were forbidden and could hurt Emily, but they couldn't resist the attraction. From that evening, Jason and Margaret began meeting secretly. They used every opportunity to be alone. Jason invented various pretexts to come to the Kowalski house when Emily wasn't there. Margaret, in turn, began to organize charity events more often, where Jason supposedly helped with the organization. Their relationship was passionate and intense. For Jason, Margaret was the embodiment of mature femininity, experienced and self-confident. He felt like a man next to her, not just a college student. Margaret was experiencing a second youth, enjoying the attention and energy of her young lover. However, the feeling of guilt did not leave either of them. Jason was tormented by the need to lie to Emily, whom he still loved. He couldn't understand how he could have such strong feelings for two such different women at the same time. Margaret was tormented by thoughts of betraying her daughter, but she couldn't give up the relationship that made her feel alive. The situation was complicated by the fact that Emily began to notice changes in Jason's behavior. He became more absent-minded, often canceling their meetings under various pretexts. Emily felt that she was losing connection with her loved one but attributed this to stress from study and work. Meanwhile, the bond between Jason and Margaret was growing deeper. They began to dream of a future together, although both understood how unrealistic it was. Margaret even talked about moving together to another city where no one knows them. Jason, caught up in emotions, agreed, although deep down he understood that it was impossible. Their secret meetings became more and more risky. They met in remote motels, in parks late in the evening, even in the Kowalski house when Emily was in class. Each such meeting strengthened their emotional dependence on each other but also increased the risk of exposure. By the end of this chapter, their relationship had reached a boiling point. Passion, mixed with a sense of guilt and fear of exposure, created an explosive mixture. Both understood that it couldn't go on like this for long, but no one dared to take the first step to end the relationship. They were like two people walking on a tightrope over an abyss, understanding that they could fall at any moment, but unable to stop. With each passing day, keeping the secret became increasingly difficult. Jason began to neglect his studies, his grades deteriorated, which did not go unnoticed by Emily. She tried to talk to him, to understand the reason for the changes, but Jason brushed her off with general phrases about stress and fatigue. Margaret was also experiencing increasing pressure. Her friends began to notice changes in her behavior. She seemed to have become younger, started taking better care of herself, but often looked distracted and nervous. Some even began to suspect that she had a secret admirer, although no one could imagine who it might be. One evening, an incident occurred that nearly revealed their secret. Emily unexpectedly returned home earlier than usual and found her mother and Jason in the living room. At first glance, nothing unusual was happening, but the atmosphere in the room was tense. Jason looked embarrassed, and Margaret was nervously fixing her hair. Emily felt that something was wrong, but couldn't understand what exactly. After this incident, Jason and Margaret became even more cautious, but their meetings did not stop. On the contrary, the danger of exposure seemed to only intensify their attraction to each other. They began to look for more sophisticated ways to meet, using encrypted messages and secret signs. Meanwhile, Emily sank deeper into depression. She felt that she was losing Jason but didn't understand the reason. Her academic performance also began to suffer, which further aggravated the situation. Margaret, seeing her daughter's condition, experienced agonizing pangs of conscience, but couldn't find the strength to end her relationship with Jason. The situation reached a critical point when Emily, trying to figure out what was happening, began to follow Jason. She noticed that he often came to their house when she wasn't there and spent a lot of time alone with Margaret. Suspicions began to creep into her soul, but the thought of a romance between her boyfriend and mother seemed so absurd that Emily drove it away. Jason, feeling the growing tension, began to think about ending his relationship with Margaret and trying to save his relationship with Emily. He understood that he couldn't continue living in lies, that it was destroying not only his life but also the lives of two women dear to him. However, every time he tried to talk about it with Margaret, she found a way to convince him to continue their relationship. Margaret, in turn, began to show signs of jealousy and possessiveness. She couldn't come to terms with the thought that Jason was still dating Emily, although she understood the absurdity of her position. She began to demand more time and attention from Jason, which only exacerbated the situation. By the end of this chapter, the tension had reached its peak. Jason found himself caught between two women, unable to make a choice. Emily increasingly suspected that something serious was happening, but couldn't believe the worst. Margaret was balancing on the brink of a breakdown, torn by conflicting feelings of love for her daughter and passion for Jason. The atmosphere was charged to the limit, and it was clear that the slightest spark was enough to cause an explosion that would destroy the lives of all participants in this love triangle. None of them suspected how tragic the consequences of their actions would be and what price they would have to pay for their mistakes. The morning of June 15th began as usual. Emily left for college classes, leaving Margaret alone at home. Jason, exhausted by a sleepless night and tormented by guilt, decided it was time to put an end to this destructive relationship. He sent Margaret a message requesting a meeting, saying they needed to talk seriously. Margaret, sensing trouble, agreed to the meeting. She understood that their relationship had gone too far, but wasn't ready to let Jason go. Deep down, she hoped she could convince him to continue their affair. Jason arrived at the Kowalski house around noon. Entering the living room, he immediately got to the point, telling Margaret that their relationship had to end. He talked about his love for Emily, about how painful it was for him to lie, about his future, which he couldn't destroy for the sake of this relationship. Margaret listened to him silently, but with each word from Jason, her face became more tense. When he finished, she burst into an angry tirade. She accused him of cowardice, of using her and now abandoning her. She threatened to tell Emily everything, to ruin his reputation, to make sure he lost everything. The argument became increasingly fierce. Jason, not expecting such a reaction, tried to calm Margaret down, but his words only inflamed her more. At some point, she grabbed a heavy crystal vase and swung at Jason. Instinctively defending himself, Jason caught her arm. A struggle ensued. In the heat of the fight, they didn't notice how they ended up near the stairs. Suddenly, Margaret lost her balance and began to fall. Jason tried to hold her, but the force of inertia was too great. Margaret fell down the stairs, hitting her head on the marble floor below. Jason looked in horror at Margaret's motionless body. He rushed to her, trying to find a pulse, but to no avail. Panic overtook him. Thoughts raced feverishly through his head. He understood that he should call the police, but fear of the consequences paralyzed him. At that moment, he heard the sound of the front door opening. Emily had returned home earlier than usual. Her classes had been cancelled. Seeing Jason bending over her mother's body, she screamed. Jason, without thinking, rushed to Emily, trying to explain what had happened. But the words got stuck in his throat when he saw the horror and incomprehension in her eyes. Emily pushed him away and ran to the phone to call the police. At that moment, Jason made a fatal mistake. Instead of staying and trying to explain everything, he gave in to panic and ran out of the house. This act essentially became an admission of guilt in the eyes of the law. The police arrived a few minutes after Emily's call. They found Margaret's body at the foot of the stairs and a sobbing Emily, who could only say that she had seen Jason next to her mother's body before he ran away. Thus began one of the loudest and most shocking criminal trials in the city's history. The story of a secret affair, betrayal, and death quickly spread through the news, shocking the public with its tragedy and unexpected turns. The police immediately began a large-scale search for Jason Hudson. His photograph was sent to all police departments in the state and appeared in the news with the label, "Wanted for questioning in connection with murder." Jason's parents were shocked by what was happening and couldn't believe that their son could be involved in Margaret Kowalski's death. Detective Alex Rodriguez, an experienced investigator with 20 years of experience, led the investigation. He began with a thorough examination of the crime scene. Forensic experts determined that Margaret's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury received from falling down the stairs. However, signs of struggle were found on the body, bruises on the arms and shoulders. Emily, still in a state of shock, gave her testimony. She talked about Jason's strange behavior in recent weeks, about her suspicions, and about what she saw on that fateful day. Her words made Detective Rodriguez think about possible motives for the crime. The investigation took an unexpected turn when police discovered deleted messages between Margaret and Jason on Margaret's computer. Cybercrime specialists were able to recover part of the correspondence, which unequivocally indicated a romantic relationship between them. This discovery shocked everyone, especially Emily, who couldn't believe in the betrayal of her mother and boyfriend. Detective Rodriguez began interviewing Margaret and Jason's friends and acquaintances. Gradually, a picture of a secret affair that had lasted several months emerged. Some witnesses remembered strange glances and gestures exchanged between Margaret and Jason at public events. However, no one could have guessed how far their relationship had gone. Meanwhile, Jason was hiding in an abandoned hunting cabin in the woods not far from the city. He was scared, confused, and didn't know what to do next. 3 days after the incident, exhausted by hunger and guilt, he decided to surrender to the police. Jason's arrest became a sensation. During the interrogation, he confessed to a romantic relationship with Margaret but insisted that her death was an accident. He described in detail the events of that day, the argument and struggle that led to Margaret's tragic fall. The district attorney, Samantha Wilson, decided to charge Jason with manslaughter. She argued that even if Margaret's death was an accident, Jason's actions, concealing the affair, the argument that led to physical confrontation, and his flight from the scene, indicated his responsibility for what happened. The case received wide public resonance. It raised complex ethical questions about intergenerational relationships, betrayal, and the boundaries of responsibility in complex emotional situations. Society was divided between those who considered Jason a victim of circumstances and those who saw him as a cold-blooded manipulator who took advantage of a lonely woman. Emily, crushed by double betrayal and the loss of her mother, refused any contact with Jason and his family. She sank into deep depression, interrupted her college studies, and began seeing a psychotherapist. As the trial approached, tension in society grew. Everyone was waiting to see what decision the court would make in this complex and ambiguous case, which had touched the most sensitive strings of public consciousness. The trial of Jason Hudson lasted 3 weeks and attracted national media attention. The courtroom was packed every day, and crowds gathered in front of the courthouse, expressing support for either the prosecution or the defense. Prosecutor Samantha Wilson built the case on the argument that Jason had abused the trust of an older woman by entering into a romantic relationship with her, and then, when the situation got out of control, became indirectly responsible for her death. She emphasized Jason's moral responsibility and his attempt to flee the crime scene. The defense, led by experienced attorney Michael Burns, insisted that Margaret's death was a tragic accident. They presented Jason as a young man entangled in a complex emotional situation, who never intended to harm Margaret. They explained Jason's flight as panic and shock from what had happened. After long deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. Jason Hudson was found guilty of manslaughter, but with a recommendation for leniency. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. The public reaction to the sentence was mixed. Many considered it too lenient, given the circumstances of the case. Others believed that Jason had already been punished enough by the loss of his reputation and future prospects. Emily Kowalski was not present at the sentencing. She had left town, trying to start a new life and heal her emotional wounds. In an interview with a local newspaper, she said, "I lost the 2 closest people to me in one day. No sentence will bring my mom back or heal the pain of betrayal." Jason's parents, devastated by grief and shame, sold their house and moved to another state. They promised to support their son during his incarceration and help him start a new life after his release. This case became the subject of numerous discussions in society. It raised important questions about the boundaries of personal relationships, responsibility for one's actions, and how one thoughtless decision can change the lives of many people. Psychologists and sociologists used this case to study the phenomenon of intergenerational romantic relationships and their impact on family dynamics. Several scientific papers were published analyzing the psychological aspects of the behavior of all participants in this tragedy. A year after the sentencing, local journalist Lisa Chen published a book titled Forbidden Passion: The Story of Jason and Margaret, based on interviews with friends and relatives of those involved in the events. The book became a bestseller and further fueled public interest in this story. In conclusion, it's worth noting that this tragedy has no winners. All its participants suffered heavy losses. Jason lost his freedom and the future he had dreamed of. Emily lost her mother and the person she loved. Margaret paid the highest price, her life. This story serves as a stark reminder of how important it is to be honest with oneself and others, of the need to control one's emotions and think about the consequences of one's actions. It shows how fragile human relationships can be and how easily one can destroy the lives of many people with one careless act. Ultimately, this tragedy leaves us with many questions about the nature of love, loyalty, betrayal, and forgiveness. Questions to which there may be no unambiguous answers, but which make us think about our own decisions and actions.